if you look out now and you say what's going to happen election wise, and as we get closer to the election, I mean, we'll talk about it, not so much in a political way, but I think it's worth sort of understanding from an investing perspective. And one of the things that will come up is the more, I remember Lou Dobbs, gosh, I think he still hasn't forgiven me because I once said, well, these are kind of isolationist style policies about Donald Trump on the global scale. And Lou lit into me. And this was during a commercial break. What do you mean isolationist? And I was like, well, you could look at America first. I think that Trump is isolationist, and I'll say that, sorry, Lou, in terms of saying, okay, is this good for the U.S., right? We don't need to be running around. And I'm not saying isolationism is bad necessarily. I think that you need to, walk softly but carry a big stick. I mean, make sure you get one HELL of a military that is ready, willing, and able to go and make sure you're firing on all cylinders. You need a little patriotism, right? In order for people to stand up for the country as well, because people have to be willing when the time comes. But simultaneously, you don't want to get yourself involved in everything because that comes with other headaches. But I think when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade, if Donald Trump is in charge, then actually some of these countries, like Russia and other emerging markets, are going to have to reckon with the fact that he's going to make decisions based on what's good for the U.S. And if it's not good for the U.S., he's going to use trade and tariffs to his advantage to influence the situation. So you look at Claudia Sheinbaum coming into Mexico and she believes in porous borders. Hey, why? You want to immigrate to the USA? That's not my problem. Well, he's going to go in and say, hey, Claudia, you know what? It is your problem. And I'm going to make sure it's your problem because I'm going to tariff you until there's no tomorrow. And by the way, those U.S. treasuries that you're holding, he may say, you're done. And if you're Claudia, if you're Mexico, or you're any country anywhere, you might start thinking about, okay, it's not just Biden, right? And whatever happens to be sort of the whim of the quote unquote deep state and whatever battles they're going to fight, you're dealing with this whoever is in charge.
Yep. And I mean, look, the idea that Trump is isolationist, I think.
Oh, you're going to sound like Lou.
I'm going to sound.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's more that he doesn't want to get bogged down by these multilateral institutions, right? By NATO or by the United Nations. And of course, the countries that control those institutions or have a lot of influence over those institutions, they want us to be bogged down, right? They want us to be sort of to cede our sovereignty to their arrangements and their alliances. And Trump is saying, no, we're going to act in our own best interests. We're not going to disengage from the world. We're just going to interact with the world in a more kind of
U.S.-centric
unilateral way.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me anyway to make sense, I guess. And, it does. I mean, I actually think his foreign policy, his economic policy, those policy spheres, if you would, they're absolutely outstanding. And I think that a lot of people are sort of realizing that, which is reflected in the polls, et cetera, when they look at such an inflationary environment as we're in right now. I mean, he had some good people with good ideas and a good team around, my former co-host being one of them there, Larry Kudlow, but just a lot of smart people thinking about the economy, thinking about foreign relations, even some of his advisors, even his informal advisors, Jack Keane, who was a 4-star general. I mean, just people who are thinking about this, I think, in really, really smart ways. So I think that his approach is a good one. I just think that as an investor, right, what is it that I'm thinking about? I think regardless of who is president, this trend is here to stay, and that you're going to continue to see emerging market countries diversify away from U.S. holdings and away from the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're doing everything they can to, and it's just in their interest to figure that out. And that's going to be a support for gold. Perhaps it'll be to some extent support for Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. But it's just rational for them to want to do that. And as those economies grow, they are going to become a bigger, when we fast forward 20 years into the future, the BRICS countries, the global South, whatever they like to call themselves, they're going to be more relevant as part of the global economy than they are
You think
today.
so? I mean, because I'm not a big EM player. And by the way, I started my career. I know you started your career too in EM. I mean, I was at Goldman. We were trading sovereign debt for emerging market countries. But even all that said, I'm not like a big, and I don't think, and you aren't either, and we don't have any sort of big EM focus going on right now. I mean, maybe that's a really long-term play. Maybe there's some things that are starting to look attractive, but that's been kind of dead money for a while.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not saying EM stocks are the place to be,
Okay.
because but it's just those economies. I was looking 25 years ago in today's dollars. The Chinese economy, I think, was $1 trillion. Now it's 18. So look, they're coming off of a low base. They have the technology. They have the hard, the willingness
Work
to work.
ethic. Mm-hmm.
They're in a lot of these countries, not China, but other countries. There's population growth. Contrast it with the G7. Contrast it with Europe. Contrast it with Japan. The United States is the growthiest of the G7. So it's just sort of the demographic, realities. And the point being, those economies, their stock markets might not outperform, but those economies will grow and grow, and their GDPs will grow, and there'll be more opportunity for them to kind of try to figure out an alternative monetary framework that's not completely dependent on the U.S.
When you think about that global growth scenario, and certainly the U.S. has been the engine of that, I guess one of the things that we'll want to try to protect is our ability to have those markets, right? Because you don't want to necessarily outsource everything to, that's been sort of these are the trade disputes, right, that Trump was having, because it's like, and I love the fact that like suddenly people were talking about the trade deficit, which just cracked me up because that was never in the news. And he was like, look at the trade deficit. But it's a relevant thing to think about. I know that everybody's like, oh yeah, but they discount it because they're thinking, well, we trade in different ways. Nonetheless, the majority of the working class in America is very entrenched in manufacturing, which means the trade deficit actually does matter, right? And so as we fast forward and China grows and India grows and plenty of other emerging markets grow as economies, I guess protecting our ability to really be sort of the center that's selling, hopefully, to them and creating stuff that will go to those markets will be relevant.
There is a flip. I was actually speaking to a friend of mine who's also an investor. And the flip side is, if we aren't the reserve currency as much anymore, and there is this sort of migration away from the dollar, that could actually be beneficial for U.S. exports and U.S. manufacturing. So it's not all, a completely bleak situation. Things have a way of balancing and correcting.
Well, that's all good to hear.